Today at the National Press Club, the former Prime Minister, Paul Keating. Mr Keating will speak on Australia's place in the world. He's a critic of the AUKUS security agreement and concerned by the state of Australia's relationship with China. Paul Keating with today's National Press Club address.
Good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club and today's Westpac address. I'm the club's president, Laura Tingle. Our guest today is former Prime Minister Paul Keating, and he joins me in the ABC studio in Sydney for a conversation about Australia's strategic framework, which is being beamed back to the Press Club in Canberra, from where members of the working press will put questions to him after our conversation. In his long career in federal politics, Paul Keating was one of the most regular speakers at the National Press Club. Between 1983 and 1996, he appeared 19 times as Treasurer and Prime Minister, and in 1991 as Labor's most prominent backbencher. Mr Keating, welcome to the National Press Club. It's good to have you back.
Good, Laura. Nice to be with you.
Yeah. It's been almost 26 years, a long time. That suggests you feel there's something significant you want to talk about on the back of the subject of today's conversation.
Well, I haven't rushed back. Let's make the point. But I'm back to talk about what I see as a deterioration in our strategic settings. I think the country is now very much at odds with its geography and it's lost its way. I thought rather than me provide a set speech, you and I would have a conversation about this, perhaps off notes. But I want to get to this point. We arrived here in 11 little boats, 1/10 the size of a Manly ferry, and after dropping anchor at what we call Sydney Cove, then claimed the whole 4,000 kilometre hinterland, 2,500 miles. I mean, for chutzpah, that takes a bit of beating, you know. And we got away with it. Not because of our treatment of the poor Aborigines, who ended up getting the rough end of the stick right from the get-go, but we got away with it even after other states, like parts of then Indonesia, the Kingdom of Thailand, then Siam, China and its large mercantile fleets, they could have claimed Australia in the 16th or the 17th or the 18th century. But here it was waiting for us, the greatest gift any nation has ever been given. An island, a continent of our own, and a border with nobody. All we had to do to keep it is be in it. Be in the region. Be in the region and be happy to be in the region. What a gift. What a gift. You know, what was it, just virtually a handful of us, you know. But no, we're not happy to be in the region. We're still trying to find our security from Asia rather than in Asia. So here we had the Prime Minister going back to Cornwall, where James Cook had left 245 years earlier, and where Arthur Phillip and the First Fleet had left 233 years earlier. Here we are back there to find our security from Asia. I mean, the ignominy of it, the appalling ignominy of it, speaks volumes about our incapacity to absorb the region, enjoy the region, be part of the region, and to celebrate the fact we've been here. The thing is, the area that matters most to Australia, the area which should be our strategic habitat, is the Indonesian archipelago. 250 million people in an arc across the northern reaches of Australia, a central part of ASEAN. This should be where, and in my time as Prime Minister, where I focused most particularly, and other as well, but particularly myself, this is where we matter most. But instead of that, we've now got this sort of fiction, the thing called the Indo-Pacific, like a big rectangular box. You know, and on one end of the box is India, and the other end of the box is Japan. But in other words, but but we're not focusing on the middle of the box, which is Indonesia and ASEAN. We're on either end. It's like a seesaw at the park. You know, we're on the wobbly ends, but not the pivot at the middle, right? And of course, this is just a fiction. There is no way India is going to find itself with any naval military flotilla in the South China Sea to protect us from China, unless the Chinese in somehow turn in a big position in the Indian Ocean. If the Chinese are not in the Indian Ocean, then there's no way the Indians are going to be in the South China Sea. I've always believed that India will never be part of the East Asian system, and that us believing that we can have a meeting in the White House and we call it the Quad and the Indians are going to be there. I mean, we need to remember this. The country in the world closest to India is Russia. They have an inter-country commission that was set up in Indira Gandhi's time with the Soviet Union. That is still principally their principal relationship in the world. 75% of their military equipment comes from Russia. India is part of the Shanghai Cooperation Conference, which includes Pakistan, China, some of the stand countries. In other words, India looks west to Pakistan and the Middle East. It does not look east to East Asia. That is the real position. Now, is that too hard to work out? You know, is that too hard for people to work? Now, take Japan. Let's take Japan. Here they are. The Bourbons, the LDP, Liberal Democratic Party, the Bourbons of the Pacific, learned nothing and forgotten nothing. You know, 80 years they've had to atone for the crimes committed by themselves in Manchuria, and of course in the rape of Nanjing, then the Chinese capital in 1937. You know, fundamentally they won't do it. So they should have reached a point of accommodation with China years ago. I mean, for years they should have seen China rising and understood the scale of it. You know, there's 160 million of them. There's 1.4 billion Chinese. So, I mean, if you had tuppence worth of common sense, you're a Japanese leader, you would be accommodating yourself to China, finding a point of accommodation. No, they're hanging out for some Quad, which has us in it, the Americans in it, and the Indians in it. You know, I mean, this is a kind of, you know, hopeless, the kind of hopeless environment we're in. So the thing is that Japan will not settle with China. It relies upon American presence, and so I've taken the view always that engagement with China and its absorption of the region will establish a better framework for both China and the United States to work in, including Australia. And China's simply too big and too central to be ostracised. You know, I want to quote something which I think is important. Zbigniew Brzezinski, you know, after Nixon had the meeting with Mao to do the great rapprochement. Nixon lost the presidency and President Jimmy Carter followed him, you know. And Zbigniew Brzezinski was Carter's foreign policy advisor. He was the one left to do the Mao deal, right? Now, Brzezinski is a Pole. He was 11 or 12 years of age when Stalin and Hitler cut Poland into two. He would have been 15 or 16 when Warsaw was wiped out. And this is a guy, in terms of sort of hardline ideologues, this is a guy who's on the hard right of the American scene, Atlantic scene. He has this to say. He said America should tacitly accept the reality of China's geopolitical preeminence on the mainland of Asia, as well as China's ongoing emergence as a predominant Asian economic power. Right? This is the coldest of the Cold War warriors. The coldest, right? America should tacitly accept the reality of China's geopolitical preeminence on the mainland of Asia, as well as China's ongoing emergence as a predominant Asian economic power. America's strategic policy strategy should not be to contain China, but to engage it in a larger hub of cooperative relationships that by themselves also have shaped their own relationship between the US and China. Now, this is where the smart hard guys are in relation to China. So we've got to say, well, you know, this is not happening, and what is happening. And here I'd like to just talk about, you know, I've always believed, you know, you've followed my career a long time. I always think the big coordinates command the picture. You know, in October 2020, the IMF, in its annual report, nominated China as the world's largest economy. Right? It says China's economy is now 20% larger than the United States, 24 trillion versus 20 trillion. A report which was endorsed by the CIA. So you've got the IMF and the CIA out there saying China is 20% bigger than the United States now. And these are the key numbers. I don't know whether journalists write notes these days or it's all audio visual, but these are the key numbers. American GDP per capita is 60,000. Chinese GDP per capita is 10,000. 10 versus 60. But as China is moving out of its old model of cheap manufactured goods into higher orders of manufacturing and services, their incomes are going to rise. But at $10,000 per capita, China is 120% bigger than the US. How many years is it going to take China to get to 20,000? Not 60. There's no way that China is going to get to 60,000, but with this highly urbanised, developed economy of theirs, it'll take a decade perhaps? So if it gets to 20,000 US per capita, it will be 2.5 times bigger than the United States. 250% of the United States. Right? To which the United States says, well, that's all very interesting, but look, if you behave yourself, you Chinese, you can be a stakeholder in our system. You know, this is the Bob Zellick line. You know, we welcome China as a stakeholder. And look, you wouldn't have to be Xi Jinping or anybody to take the view, if you're a Chinese national, to say, well, hang on, let me get this right. We are already 1.25 times bigger than you. We'll soon be twice as big as you. And we may be 2.5 times as big as you. But we can be a stakeholder in your system. Is that it? You know, I mean, it'd make a cat laugh. You know, that's the sort of where we are. Yeah, that is a stakeholder in a US-run system. And you see, this is the G7. They all met in Cornwall. You know, backslapping operation in Cornwall. All the good guys met in Cornwall. All the bad guys were left out. You know, the G20 didn't meet. You know, and guess what? The bad guys didn't turn up. When we got to Glasgow, China wasn't there. Russia wasn't there. These are the big emitters, you know. So for the global, even for the global commons, we can't get this right. My point is that China is now so big and it's going to grow so large, it will have no precedent in modern economic or social history, and therefore our challenge is to have the United States remain as a balancing and conciliating power in Asia, which I've said over and over again, but have it come to a point of accommodation where it acknowledges China's preeminence in East Asia and the Asian mainland, in which case we can start to move towards a sensible relationship again with China instead of taking... Now, look, the Chinese are in their rude phase, you know, they're in the adolescent phase of their diplomacy. They've got testosterone running everywhere, you know. But we have to deal with them because their power will be so profoundly big in this part of the world. So, you know, here we are running to Cornwall to find our security in Asia. I mean, really, you know. So we are at odds with our geography and we have lost our way.
Well, let's start with talking about China.
Yeah.
the big change in the last 4 or 5 years is that people have become alarmed about where China is heading.
Yeah.
They see it as being aggressive in the South China Sea with the build-up of military assets on islands, 27 outposts in the Spratly and Paracel Islands, for example.
Yeah.
And you have been accused by some commentators of being a chief apologist for China. What do you believe China's ambitions are?
Well, I'll deal with a couple of these points, including the apologist point. Look, China... Henry Kissinger said something which is worth repeating here, which is pretty much my own view, if I can find it. I wrote this down in a meeting opening. He said he did not believe China has a military-based policy designed to achieve military domination, nor is its policy about annexing contiguous territories, in other words, the countries around it. He thought its overarching policy objective was to keep the US away from Chinese borders. He said he did not believe China wants a confrontation with the United States. He said, being Chinese, the Chinese will develop a concept of coexistence. So basically what they're saying is, until not many years ago, the US Pacific Fleet drove 12 miles off the edge of the Chinese territorial sea on the Chinese continental shelf, you know. Could you imagine the attitude of the United States if the Chinese Blue Water Navy was sailing 12 miles off the territorial sea of California? I mean, there'd be outrage everywhere. So what the Chinese have been doing is getting what's called in the trade sea denial, pushing the American fleet off their coast, you know, broadly, this is it. But the Chinese interests are not in the east, they are in the west. China's real interests are in the stand countries, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Pakistan. China will control, not control is not the right word, but through the Belt and Road and the capital programs. If you go from Wuhan, the city where the rivers cross and the railways cross, the Chinese will be the major influence between everything between Wuhan and Istanbul.
What's their interest in doing? Why are they heading west?
Well, partly to increase their strategic power, and secondly, all of the old tech, which has been replaced by the new tech, as they climb out of the middle income trap, that is steel, glass, cement. People say, well, what are they going to do with their big cement plants, their big steel plants, their glass plants? What are they going to do with it? The answer is what they're going to do with it is push it down the road. They're going to put it into Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Pakistan. You know, this is where Chinese interest right now. You don't get this in the Australian public debate because it's informed by the spooks. You know, it's informed by our foreign policy debate now in Canberra is informed by the security agencies. You know, so you're not getting a macro view. You know, a macro view of China as it really is. I mean, China wants its front doorstep and its front porch, that is Taiwan, its sea. It doesn't want American naval forces in influence. It wants access out of its coast into the deeper waters of the Mariana Trench in the Pacific. That's what it's about, fundamentally.
Well, let's go
back. Could they have had this anyway? Did they need to build the islands? Probably not. You know, did I think it was incautious of them to do it? Probably yes. But would we appreciate having you know, would any country appreciate a fleet as large and as powerful as the United States 12 miles off your coast? When considering you are a bigger state than they are, you know.
So going back to the South China Sea, though, there's a lot of contests and competition for resources there, for natural gas, for fishing rights, with countries in the region, like the Philippines, like Vietnam.
Yeah.
China is being a lot more aggressive there.
Yeah. Look, I'll tell you what I said. You know, I have some of these blackguards who report me, you know. in Beijing, not in Canberra, in Beijing, I said this in 2013. I said, a lot of attention has been given to America's responsibility to respond to China's rise, right? And this is in a heavyweight meeting, right? Members of the government, Vice Premier. I said, but China too has equal responsibility for creating a new, stable and sustainable order in Asia. As it steps up to a larger leadership role, it will at the same time need to be willing to accept and respect restraints on the way in which it uses its immense strength, because the acceptance of any such restraints by great powers is the key to any successful and durable international order. Then I went on to make these points. First, and most obviously, China should continually reaffirm by word and by deed its commitment to repudiate the use or threat of force to settle disputes, just as other powers do. The stronger China becomes, the more it will need to reassure its neighbours about this, and this will depend on deeds more than words. You know, I mean, these are tough things to say in Beijing. And I said this, China will do a great deal to help build a continuing stable order in Asia if it quite unambiguously welcomes and supports a continued strong role for the United States in Asia. A stable Asian order can no longer be based on sole US leadership, but equally there can be no stable and peaceful future in Asia unless the United States plays a large and active role, and unless China accepts that role. I mean, how much tougher do you need to be to have the ning-nongs of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age notice this, you know?
So, just speaking about tough though, and words rather than deeds rather than words,
yeah.
The tribunal in The Hague found in the Philippines' favour under the UN Treaty of the Sea.
Yeah.
China isn't respecting that rule. That's not what it should be doing, based on what you've said.
Look, Laura, big powers are rude. Do you think there were any Polynesian Hawaiians on the Mayflower when it hit the east coast of America? Do you think there were any natives of Guam on the Mayflower when it arrived? Or Filipinos? I mean, these were all purloined by the United States. You know, big countries are rude. They do this stuff.
Well, speaking of rude, how rude should we be prepared to accept China can be? I've got Taiwan in mind.
Yeah, but China is not... This is the key point. China does not represent a contiguous threat to Australia. I mean, I think, look, the key point is this, I think, is that China is not about turning over the existing world order. It only wants to reform it. And it wants to reform it because of its own scale, right? It's signed up to the WTO. It's signed up to the IMF. It's signed up to the World Bank. It's signed up to WHO, the World Health Organization. And as you read recently, it now wants to sign up to the TPP, you know. In other words, it's the proselytiser of globalisation in the world. It's not pursuing... this is not the old Soviet Union pursuing some international ideology, some, whether universal or otherwise. It wants to be in the existing order, has signed up the existing order, but wants it reformed so it's fair. I mean, look, the Americans knocked them off. As China grew, their share of the IMF votes should have grown. The Americans denied them. As China grew, their shares of the World Bank should have grown. The Americans denied them, you know. The Americans say, we believe in, you know, the free passage of ships, but they won't sign up to the international law of the sea. You know, the Chinese are not about turning over the international system. That's the key point.
They might not be about turning over the international system, but they certainly have become much more aggressive about Taiwan. Yeah. And it's seen as a flashpoint of a potential flashpoint with the Americans. Yeah. Should we just accept at some point that that China will take a military or other approach to take over Taiwan?
Well, the first point is Taiwan is not a vital Australian interest. Let me repeat that. Taiwan is not a vital Australian interest, you know. We have no alliance with Taipei. None. There's no document you can find. we do not recognise it as a sovereign state, right? And under ANZUS commits us to consult in the event of an attack on US forces, but not an attack by US forces, right? We are committed to ANZUS for an attack on US forces, but we are not committed under ANZUS to an attack by US forces, which means Australia should not be drawn, in my view, into a military engagement over Taiwan, US-sponsored or otherwise. You know, as Xi Jinping said recently, we'll try and resolve this, you know, harmoniously. You've got to remember this. The KMT, when they drifted over to Taipei, always said, this is China. The Chinese have always said, no, we are China. They all agree they're one China. So when Chen Shui-bian was elected president of Taiwan in the late 90s, the Chinese had to make a decision about what to do about it. Because the KMT, while under Chiang Kai-shek were at odds with them by 30, 40 years later, they'd all agree it was really one China, you know. What was I going to say to you? I just forgot the point. Yeah, that's it. So Chen Chi-chen, then Foreign Minister of China, said about Chen Shui-bian's election, he said, Taiwan can have its own political system. It can have its own parliament. It can have its own flag. It can have its own system of laws. It can have its own economy. It just cannot say it's not Chinese. So that was the formula. They can have all of this, but they cannot say it's not Chinese. The only time the Chinese will attack or be involved with Taiwan is if the Americans and the Taiwanese try and declare a change in the status of Taiwan. If Taiwan stays as it is, I think Xi Jinping's general point, and this has been the point of other Chinese presidents, that harmoniously the Chinese people in what would otherwise be a civil war will come to terms with one another. You've got to remember, the trade between the two is enormous. The trade between Taiwan, which is a magnificent economy, and China is huge. You know, I mean, Taiwanese own chunks of, you know, Shanghai. I mean, they all own properties, you know. I mean, you've got to understand how this place works, you know. But, you know, so the thing is, under ANZUS we have no commitments to be supporting any ill-conceived US attempts to try and blow this up. But frankly, I don't think the United States will, you know.
What should we be doing now to rebuild our relationship with China then? Well,
at least give it respect. I mean, you know, having Maurice Payne on Insiders, which is a sort of peekaboo, you know, for show for insomniacs, you know, tell without it, I understand a cabinet decision, no, we're going to put inspectors into Wuhan about the virus. There's even, I think in her language, there was even talk about inspectors of the kind we had for the nuclear inspection of Iraq, you know, this sort of stuff. You know, this is, it won us nothing. It was going to happen anyway under the WTO. It cost us hugely. You know, we had knocked them off in lots of equity transactions in Australia. We'd refuse them. We'd put tariffs on their goods, which are still being fought over in the WTO to this day, you know. And so what the Chinese want, I think, is respect for what they've created, you know. I mean, what were we to leave them with? You know, I mean, our central proposition should be that the rise of China is entirely valid. What were we to leave them? To be hanging around in poverty, 5 families to a little house, 1 toilet, bad sanitation, no education, you know, for 20% of humanity, you know. 20% of humanity drags themselves out of poverty, and we say, oh, no, this is not right. You've got to stay in the mud. Know your place, stay down there in the mud. And the Chinese say, well, hang on, it's taken us 40 years to get to $10,000 US per head. Isn't that good for us? Isn't that good for Australia? Isn't that good for the world? Cheaper goods, buying your iron ore, selling you cheap, flat screen TVs, all the rest of the thing. Isn't that good? Isn't it better 20% of humanity being dragged out of poverty? We should say yes. I think what the Chinese want is the acknowledgement of what they have, the validity of what they've done, and what they have created. The legitimacy. The legitimacy of the rise of China from its colonial past and from its poverty.
So Australia's ambassador to Washington, Arthur Sinodinos, has said something explicitly today, which has sort of been around in the background of the AUKUS arrangement, which is essentially that nuclear submarines give us the capacity to be in a forward strategic position in the South China Sea rather than in the defence of Australia.
Give us a break. Yeah.
So essentially, what should our defence posture be right now within that strategic framework?
8 submarines against China. When we get the submarines in 20 years' time, it'll be like throwing a handful of toothpicks at a mountain. A handful of toothpicks at a mountain. Kim Beazley and I built the Collins-class submarines. Kim always had the Admiral's hat on. I had the money and the guns. I built the Collins. I built the Anzac frigates. They were built for the defence of Australia. Their range was to stop any incoming vessels, military vessels, against us. What Sinodinos is talking about are attack-class submarines to contain Chinese submarines, the hunter-killer submarines, to attack them and knock them out. Now, what's that got to do with the defence of Australia? And what possible impact could we have militarily with 8 submarines, which might... Just say this about the submarines. These Virginia-class submarines were designed in the 1990s. The time we have half a dozen of them, it'll be 2045 or 50. They'll be 50 or 60 years old. In other words, our new submarines will be old tech. It'll be like buying an old 747, And here we are, we're going to wait, 20-odd years to get the first one, and 35 or 40 years to get the lot, for these what will be then very old boats. In fact, the newest submarine in the world, the newest design one, is a French low-enriched nuclear one. If we'd have been sensibly looking at, thinking, no, we need more range than the Collins can provide at 3,500 tonnes, we need to go to 4.5 or 5. The obvious choice, if we were unhappy with diesels, the obvious choice was the most modern submarine on the drawing board, which is the French nuclear submarine. No, we're rushing over. This has got, the Liberal Party fingerprints all over it. No, we're rushing back to the Americans, right? So we're going to rush back to a dated design with these things. But the whole point of these hunter-killer submarines is to round up the Chinese nuclear submarines and keep them in the shallow waters on the Chinese continental shelf before they can get into the Mariana Trench and become invisible. In other words, to stop the Chinese having a second strike nuclear capability against the United States. Right? So this is the game we're now in. In the Collins game, we're in the defence of Australia. In the Virginia class game, we are hunter-killing Chinese submarines. This changes our whole relationship, and that's confirmed by our ambassador. This is how stupid and bald they are.
How important is how important was, I suppose, or is the role of the French and the Europeans and other powers in showing an interest in the Pacific?
Oh, hugely important. Look, the French had a great relationship with India because de Gaulle pulled out of NATO. The Americans pushed, like they pushed the Labour Prime Minister of Iran, Mossadegh, out in favour of the Shah. You know, everything they touch turns to you know what. They pushed Indira Gandhi away, and she tied up with the Soviet Union. When de Gaulle turned his back on NATO and went independent, they developed a relationship with India. The French were introducing us into that relationship. In fact, a third meeting of India, France and Australia was to be held the week the submarine was cancelled, and so the meeting got cancelled. I mean, France is the sole nuclear European power. Germany, a larger country, doesn't have nuclear weapons and doesn't have the sophistication of supersonic aircraft or nuclear submarines. The French have geographic assets in the Pacific. You know, it is strangely but truly a European power with a Pacific complexion. What do? We treat them appallingly. You know, we walk away from. I mean, if we're unhappy about the fact that we're having trouble trying to stuff a diesel engine into the hull of a French nuclear submarine, why didn't we at least inquire about their most modern nuclear submarine? You know, this is all about, you know, what's this young guy that works, a person that works in PMC?
Andrew Shearer, was it?
Andrew Shearer. See, Andrew Shearer's this world. Can't wait to get the staplers back onto the Americans. And you've got the ambassador, you know, a local Sydney genius out there telling us now, no, by the way, we want... You know, why would we need seakeeping for Australia's submarines in the defence of Australia that are able to stand off the Chinese coast 13 flying hours away if it's not to attack Chinese naval assets? And when you start attacking Chinese naval assets, you're a different state. See, look, the Chinese, hard-nosed as they are, would say, look, Australia's got these Collins-class submarines, they're effective, they're quiet, but they're not in our field. They're theirs, right? We're not going down there. We don't care. No, we're saying, oh, no. We've got a better story for you. We're going to get American nuclear attack class submarines that can stay on station, and you know what we'll do? We'll hunt your submarines down in the shallow waters of your continental plate. You know, beauty. You know.
So my final question to you before we go to my colleagues in Canberra is, coming back to your point about Indonesia and ASEAN, you say that they should be at the centre of our thinking.
Yeah, sure.
How would that work? I mean, are you talking about sort of liaison with the Indonesian army?
Well, I put together, as you know, a security treaty with President Suharto and the government of Indonesia and the army of Indonesia with Kansas words. It's the last thing I did as Prime Minister in November 1995, right? John Howard lost that with President Habibie over our skiting over Timor. You know, Habibie suspended it. But you just imagine if we'd have spent the last 25 years putting Indonesian officers through our staff colleges, 25 years in security terms with Indonesia and its army, instead of Iraq and Afghanistan, instead of Howard's little escapades, if we'd have stuck to my script, imagine how much safer Australia would be now if we were back to that relationship. I mean, we have now just a peripheral relationship with Indonesia, the central state in our security. The central state, geographically, for our security is Indonesia. We have a peripheral relationship with them. And, of course, in ASEAN, every leader in ASEAN knows that we have no relationship with Beijing. So why would the Prime Minister of Malaysia or Singapore or Thailand talk to us about East Asia when we are non-speakies with the biggest power, the Chinese? If we'd have played our cards properly and weren't running off to Iraq and running off to, but focusing on where we live, on our geography, we would either be the Secretariat of ASEAN or at least a member. And where are we now? Nowhere.
So we'll move to our questions from the Canberra Press Gallery in Canberra, starting with Stephen Jedgetts from the ABC.
Thanks, Laura, and thanks, Mr. Keating, for your remarks today. You've said that you believe that China is in its adolescence when it comes to its diplomacy, which seems to imply that you believe that China will moderate or mature in both word and deed over the coming years. Can I ask, what gives you the confidence to make that assessment, if I've assessed you correctly, given that most preeminent scholars of China believe that China's turn towards greater authoritarianism may well see it become not only more unpredictable, but more likely to behave in a hostile manner in coming years?
Well, it has become, you're correct, it has become more authoritarian. There's no doubt about that. You know, civil surveillance at home, all the rest. But at the same time, it wants to be part of the world. I made the points earlier. It had joined the WTO, it had joined the IMF, the World Bank. It now wants to join the TPP. It's clear to anybody that China does not want to overturn the international system. Xi Jinping 3 years ago was in Davos speaking in favour of globalisation. They're out there this week speaking about globalisation again. So therefore, I just, even though things are tighter at home than they've been politically, there's also a lot of other good things going on. I mean, they're knocking over the big, appropriately, knocking over the big tech platforms, which the Americans have not. I mean, in America, you want search, you've got Google. You want social policy, you've got Facebook. You know, you want software, you've got Microsoft. That's it, you know. The Chinese are going to have a much more civil society. They're going to make sure that they are seeking to have the extremes of wealth moderated, and they want these big platforms operating in a socially good way. So I think that China will become, notwithstanding your point, which I agree with, it has become more authoritarian, it will be a more civil society than the United States. I mean, there were 83 school shootings in America since 2018. 83 people carrying guns around. I mean, it's a crazy land. 24, the average run rate now, 24 schools get attacked by shooters every year in the United States. You know, it's not civil. You saw what Trump did, trying to overturn the election. You know, you've still got a big a pile of Republicans still believe that the current president was not legally elected. Now, you know, the great challenge for the United States is for its remoralisation. There's a challenge for China for its moralisation, and these questions about surveillance and the rest. But the challenge for America and the underpinnings of American greatness, or return to American greatness, is its own remoralisation. No more unlimited attacks like Iraq, Afghanistan, like the Arab Spring, like knocking off Shah Reza, knocking off Mossadegh in Iran, like the fight in Vietnam. I mean, you know, so the key point, the key takeaway is China is showing every reason to remain in the system. The other thing is, it's not the Soviet Union. It's not pushing an ideology. It does not want to command three oceans like the United States. It does not want to command the Atlantic. It does not want to command the Mediterranean. It's interested in the corner of one ocean, its ocean, you know.
The next question is from Daniel Hurst.
Daniel Hurst from Guardian Australia. Mr Keating, you called for a sensible relationship between Australia and China. In your view, is there space in that sensible relationship for Australia to speak up on human rights, particularly in Hong Kong and Xinjiang? And secondly, you talked about Taiwan. China wants its front door stop and its front porch. Are the most recent actions, including the incursions into Taiwan's air defence identification zones, consistent with what you said about Xi Jinping pledging to do it peacefully?
Just give me the first part of the question again. I was just looking for an
First part is, in your prescription of a sensible relationship between Australia and China, is there space for Australia to raise human rights issues?
It should always speak out on human rights. We should always reserve the right to speak out on human rights, whether it's the Uyghurs in China. But can I also say, it's the Muslims in Kashmir. You know, here's Modi, Prime Minister Modi, our new friend, who has suspended, repudiated the autonomy of Kashmir, which is 94% Muslim. No wave of indignation in the Sydney Morning Herald or the Age about that. I mean, India's an ally. We don't talk about allies, we only talk about notional enemies, you know. So I believe Australia should always have the right to speak in support of, but it can't be, and this is the key point, you can speak powerfully about the rights of citizens of these countries, but it can't be the whole conversation. That doesn't displace the wider country-to-country, nation-to-nation conversation about these states. In other words, you can't let the human rights discussions supplant wholly and completely the relationship between the countries.
There was a point about the incursions into the Taiwan zone.
There's no incursion in Taiwan. They're overflying their airspace. I didn't quite get the point, you know. But as I said, look, Taiwan is fundamentally a civil war matter with the Chinese. Civil matter, not a civil war, a civil matter with the Chinese. Both of them, the whole world has regarded China and Taiwan as one country. The Taiwanese are regarded as one country. The Chinese one country. The Chen model is you can have everything you want. You just can't say you're not Chinese. And unless Taiwan tries to change its status, then I just don't think you'll see military action by the Chinese, by the PRC against Taiwan.
Next question is from Anna Henderson.
Anna Henderson from SBS World News. Mr. Keating, can I take you briefly away from the international to the domestic and just get your response to a question about the Native Title Act? Your government introduced it. We've seen recent examples of destruction of cultural sites of great significance to First Nations Australians. What's your assessment of the system as it stands now?
Look, I'm here fundamentally to talk about Australia's strategic settings. I don't want to get into domestic issues. I'm very proud of the Native Title Act. You know, every bit of political skill I had and every bit of heft I had it took to get that thing through. Indigenous Australians now have about, correct me if I'm wrong, but about 67% title to the landscape of Australia. And through that title, they enjoy autonomy and over time wealth. 200 years after we stole the titles from them, you know. There are no doubt. I mean, I made speeches in the past about reversing the onus on native title groups not having to prove that they have broke association with the land, as a more literal translation of this by the High Court since has said. But by and large, we did make a lot of progress with the Native Title Act, but I don't think this is not the time for me to discuss it. Thank you.
Anthony Galloway.
Thank you, Mr. Keating. Anthony Galloway from your favourite newspaper, the Sydney Morning Herald. I was wondering if I could ask about your comments in terms of China wanting to influence the stand countries, including Pakistan. Isn't some of those activities, particularly the Belt and Road activities in countries like Pakistan, what is in part drawing India to the east?
Well, look, the stand countries were marooned in the Soviet Union. I mean, the Soviet Union was poor. The stand countries were dirt poor. And they've sat there, no one has cared about they're rich in minerals, they're rich in resources, no one has cared about them. Not India, not even India. India might have strategically cared about them, but certainly didn't help them. What the Belt and Road Initiative is about, I think, is about lifting the quality of life and infrastructure and resources of those countries. Now, there'll be lots of players in this, as there is already in the Belt and Road Initiative. The principal player, though, will be China. And China will have, as I said earlier, a very broad influence in between its western border and basically Istanbul. Now, this is a matter, of course, of interest to the Indians, but of course we have the Great Wall of the Himalayas sitting there in between. I mean, India is in such a good position. It's got a wall that's impenetrable in the Himalayas. It's got a distended peninsula with oceans and the Bay of Biscay with water all around it. It's got 1.4 billion mainly young people, very young age. So India is in a very advantageous position strategically. I don't think they're too worried about the Chinese and the stand countries, and they would enjoy a lot of commerce into India and from India into the stand countries. The last time I met Xi Jinping, I was with Larry Summers, and after the meeting, he said to me, "What do you think of this?" I said, "Well, look, your country's been blessed. When the Mayflower arrived, you've got this arable land, you've got an ocean either side of you, you've got the Atlantic on one side and the Pacific on the other, and friends north and south in Canada and in Mexico. But as powerful as that is for you, it's now a corset. It's a corset on you. Whereas the Chinese don't have the corset. The Chinese have got stay within their bowl, basically. They've got Siberia to the north, they've got the Himalayas to the west, they've got Vietnam and Indochina to the south, and they've got this breakthrough to the stand countries." I said, what will happen, in my view, is that China, apart from being the largest economic state in the world, will be the most resourced economic state and will have much more broad strategic power by having that pathway through to Istanbul. And basically now there's 27 Chinese cities are now connected to European cities by rail. 27 now by rail. You know, I mean, China's now got 32 cities serviced by trains at 300 kilometres an hour. You know, here's our old friend, what's his name, the British Prime Minister,
Boris Johnson.
Waxing lyrical down there in Cornwall. I mean, Britain is like an old theme park sliding into the Atlantic compared to modern China. You know, I mean, China's just going to be huge, particularly as it grows that influence through there. But they will welcome, at the same time, China will welcome Indian corporate involvement in the stand countries. It won't be all theirs.
Tom Connell.
It'll be good on occasions. But on national strategic policy, broadly, you know, on China, it's been appalling. I mean, the media generally, in terms of the balance of the debate on Australia and China, has been broadly appalling, you know. And that's part of the reason I'm here today.
Tom Connell.
Tom Connell from Sky News. Mr Keating, we're talking a lot about China's motives and what people think China might do in the future. It strikes me the most relevant person to talk about is President Xi. He's likely to become, one way or another, effectively president for life. Should that be a concern? Should that ring alarm bells considering the leaders for life we've had since the 20th century?
Well, it's not. I mean, it's a good way to stay in power, I guess. It's not my way, you know. I actually believe in a community's right to dismiss the government, you know. But you've got to remember that China. China is just going past the central point about the president's attempts at longevity. China is broadly a Confucian society that believes in harmony, in authority, and it is with this background that it accepts, I think, broadly the role of the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, the idea that we have, if you don't vote at the local ballot box, that is, if you are not a Jeffersonian liberal, then you're a savage, belies the fact that China's got a 4,000-year history which has these characteristics about it. So I think that you see, let me make a further point to you, and it's an important point. That is, Premier Zhao Ziyang and Hu Yabang, the party secretary, with the support of Deng Xiaoping, wanted to move to at least some sort of multi-party system in China, within the party and then external to the party. When Hu Yabang died of cancer and the demonstrations were put on by the students in Tiananmen Square, the whole thing came crashing down. The student demonstrations, I mean, I was actually in Beijing. I saw Zhao Ziyang cry in front of me about his inability to talk the students out of the demonstrations. What happened was Deng Xiaoping said, that's it, the party has to come first. I was prepared to try this. I was prepared to try the multi-party route with Zhao Ziyang and with Hu Yabang. But look, it happened. I've got to go with the Conservatives. I've got to put the party number one. The party has been number one since then. What happened, Xi Jinping has inherited basically the Deng Xiaoping decision about the party. And of course, as you know, in the Hu Jintao years, in the 10 years that Hu Jintao was president, corruption was rampant, absolutely rampant in China. And I think Xi Jinping understands that the legitimacy of the party couldn't stand the corruption. It's the same. He took the same decision Lee Kuan Yew took. Lee Kuan Yew took the decision that Singapore could not have the command of the People's Actions Party there if people thought people were taking money on the sly and the place was corrupt. And so Xi Jinping had this war against the corruption, and he has, as Deng had made the decision, kept the party number one. Now, does that excuse surveillance of the community with facial recognition technology? No. Does it excuse their attempts to sort of control the internet and the content of it? No. But nevertheless, there is a background in Chinese society which is about harmony, which has a Confucian basis to it, which we don't understand in the West and have never had in the West. Now, does all that add up to mean, yes, this guy is better with another term? I don't think it does. I would like to see the President of China in the rules the Chinese have had, where they've had terms, I think it was 10 years, which I think is long enough. Most leaders are around 10 years. They either get tired of the job or tired in the job, So, but then the other thing is, because Xi Jinping has made so many enemies in knocking out the corruption, he may believe in personal terms, if he's not the president, he's at personal risk himself. This could be a consideration. But I'm not that close to China these days as I used to be.
Mark Kenny.
Mark Kenny, Mr Keating, thank you for your address. I'm from ANU and, of course, a director of the Press Club. You've said big states are rude, and, of course, big powers secure their perimeters. One thinks of Alaska and Hawaii, for example, in the US case. Are there any lessons, in your view, from NATO's, I think you've referred to it in the past as nibbling away at the pie crust of the old Soviet Union with the Baltic states? I'm wondering if there are any lessons there that you believe apply now in terms of understanding China's geographic assertion?
Well, Mark, the great opportunity for the United States at the end of the Cold War was to consolidate the Atlantic. I've said this in speech after speech. I said it to Bill Clinton. I've said it to economic advisors since, foreign policy advisors since. When the Cold War finished, when the wall came down, when Gorbachev left and what was his name? The new president took over. The Americans had a real chance of bringing Russia into Europe, and if not into the EU, into some operating closeness with Europe, having some understanding that in the end China, with a population 4 times that of the United States, will end up being, again, the central power in Asia. So if you wanted to balance off American power in the world, you would have consolidated Europe. You had the United States itself, Canada and Mexico. You had the European economy, which is about 30 trillion today. You had NATO as it stood. The great challenge was to bring Russia into Europe. What did they do? They did exactly the wrong thing, you know, led by that fellow, name escapes me now, it'll come to me in a second. They couldn't resist putting Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic into NATO. Then the Baltic states. NATO's border from Moscow was 1,200 miles away. Before the wall came down, it's 71 miles away now. The Russians have hated it. Of course, the northern European plain, which is as flat as a tack, runs from the north of France to St. Petersburg and to Moscow. I mean, Bonaparte went over it, Hitler went over it, and the Red Army came back over it into Berlin. There are no mountains, there are no big rivers. It is not protectable. Instead of that, no, what's the United States do? It bites off bits of the pie crust, so it annoys every Russian nationalist. And even though the Americans didn't create Putin, they did a very big job in lifting Putin to the position he is in now. Putin commands Russian nationalism in the scale of these losses, of these lost territories. Now, they were never to be part of the old Soviet Union, that was gone. But the bridging land between Germany and Russia, that is Poland, Hungary, these countries, could have been left in the into the EU. The challenge was to get them into the EU, not into NATO. And so the Americans made it, you know, probably the greatest post-war blunder in the extension of NATO, thereby denying and making much harder, and perhaps later, bringing Russia into Europe. If Russia was in Europe, and there was a much better intra-European relationship than now with France and Germany, and the United States, you look at the US, 20-odd trillion of GDP, Europe 30 trillion of GDP, throwing Mexico and Canada, you're about 40 trillion of GDP. Even the Chinese at the best are going to get to 20, in the long run 40. So in other words, if you were the United States and you wanted your centre of power, you would have had it in the Atlantic. Instead of that, the United States is still pretending it can be the security guarantor of Asia. Not just the Atlantic, of Asia, despite the fact that China is already 1.25 times larger and will soon be 2 times larger. You know? So what it should be is this. The United States should be the guarantor and the leader of the West. It should, in East Asia, be the balancer and the conciliator. In other words, it's important to have American military power in Asia to deal with any pushiness by other states, including China, as the balancing and conciliating power. But the idea that we can maintain, that America can maintain strategic primacy in Asia, which was what the pivot was all about. I mean, the reason I hopped into Gillard and into Obama at the time, and Hillary Clinton, is that they believed, you know, against all the odds, that the United States could command 3 oceans, including the Western Pacific, and be the predominant military power in Asia, despite the fact that China was then nearly the same size as the United States and soon to be larger. So that's how I see it. That's how I see it. I think the opportunity of bringing Russia into Europe still exists, in which case Europe becomes a pole, a P-O-L-E, a pole. China will be a pole, but the United States trying to command both poles off an economy which is half the size of China and 1/4 the size of its population is, of course, just wishful thinking.
Andrew Green.
Mr. Keating, from what I understand of your comments on Taiwan, you don't believe there will be a military confrontation in the immediate future, certainly one that doesn't involve the US. If China were to take Taiwan by force, what do you think Australia's response should be? And given what we've seen already with Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and the fortification of the South China Sea against international rulings, to quote an elder statesman, do you get the feeling that China is doing the West slowly?
look, I said to you in my remarks earlier, Taiwan is not a vital Australian interest. That is, we have no alliance with Taipei. There's no piece of paper sitting in Canberra which has an alliance with Taipei. We do not recognise it as a sovereign state. We've always seen it as part of China. And in militarily, the only military responses, which could be between Taiwan itself and China, were the United States to involve itself. I made clear earlier that ANZUS commits us to consult in the event of an attack on US forces, but not an attack by US forces. I mean, this is a very important point. So my view is Australia should not be drawn into a military engagement over Taiwan, US sponsored or otherwise. You know. Now you mentioned other things there about Hong Kong, etc. Look what India has done in Kashmir. You know, they've suspended, repudiated the autonomy of Kashmir, 94% Muslims. You know, what do? Do we employ the same policies against India, the same rhetoric that we've had against China on Hong Kong? I mean, after all, Hong Kong was always part of China and Taiwan. Or is it just a sort of China-centric debate? And by the way, if you're a half an ally, notwithstanding the Russians are your best pals, you can knock off the Kashmiris and we won't say anything about it.